Hello, everybody. I'm Karen Cantwell, Director of the Daffodil Centre, which is a joint venture between Cancer Council New South Wales and the University of Sydney. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to our flagship seminar today on lung cancer screening. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting today. The lands of the Daffodil Centre institutions are the Gadigal lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and really acknowledging that the subject that we're talking about today, lung cancer, has been fraught with inequity for Indigenous peoples in Australia. And I'd also like to welcome all our international speakers and attendees today. I think we have many people online from overseas and around Australia, as well as in Sydney. So welcome to our seminar today. We're very excited to present our speaker lineup. In terms of housekeeping, just a reminder that we'll be able to take Q&As. We will be having a panel session at the end, so we won't be taking questions through each talk. We'll be doing a panel at the end. So if you do have questions for the speakers, please send them through. The function will be active and we'll use them to moderate the panel discussion at the end. And we're really looking forward, of course, to that interaction and engagement with the speakers. We'll be looking to finish at 5 p.m. sharp, so I know our speakers will do their best to keep to time. So just for those of you that don't know about the Daffodil Centre, it is a joint venture, as I said, between Cancer Council New South Wales and the University of Sydney. And this flagship seminar series is an initiative of ours in order to bring together international experts in cancer control with our own researchers to discuss important and internationally relevant issues. So in the seminar today, you'll hear from our international and local experts in lung research and lung cancer research and policy. And you hear about the Nelson trial, of course, and a major international lung screening trial. You'll also hear about Australia's prospects for a national lung cancer screening program. And you'll hear about the potential economic impact of screening for lung cancer in Australia. So just to set the scene, I'd like to show you a couple of slides based on recent research published by the Daffodil Centre. And this is work by Dr. Ching-Wei Lau at the Centre and colleagues showing the prospects for cancer in Australia. This is the 25-year picture in Australia. And you can see cancer incidence rates in the dotted line blue, mortality rates in the dotted line red for males and females. You can see case numbers in the bars. And what this shows is a picture where we actually have cancer incidence rates actually stabilizing or decreasing slightly. Cancer mortality rates are also decreasing somewhat by 20% overall. But because of population growth and aging, we do expect this, this very large increase in both cancer cases and cancer deaths. And we do expect a total of more than 4.5 million new cancer cases and almost 1.5 million cancer deaths over the next 25 years to 2044. If we just go to the next slide, what does this mean for lung cancer? Well, this is the expected cancer deaths caused by smoking. This is published by Ching-Wei Lau in a recent paper as well. And this shows for men at the top and women at the bottom, for people under 75 and for people over 75 on the left and the right of the graphic, the picture for the number of cancer deaths, again, over this 25-year period, but now deaths caused directly by smoking. And unfortunately, smoking is expected to cause over 250,000 cancer deaths in this period. And again, although the smoking-related cancer mortality rates are reducing as smoking rates have reduced over time, unfortunately, again, because of population health and aging, the overall number of deaths is set to increase by about a third. And still in this period, almost 1 in 5 cancer deaths will be directly attributable to smoking, with lung cancer, of course, the most common type and the most common cause of smoking-related deaths. And this really means that we still expect, as we're coming off the epidemic, the long tail of the smoking epidemic, means that still we expect 157,000 lung cancer deaths in the next 25 years unless we do more. And this, I think, sets the scene for the potential role in lung cancer screening to reduce this toll. So I'd now like to move to our first speaker. I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce Professor Harry Koenig. He will be very well known to many in this audience. He's an epidemiologist, professor of public health and screening evaluation at Erasmus Medical Center in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam. And his major scientific contributions are in designing, running, and evaluating large-scale population-based RCTs, in screening, in evaluating international screening programs and clinical tests on effectiveness, and also in guiding public health policies on screening and primary prevention. And he's, of course, a pioneer in microstimulation modelling. So his team's multidisciplinary and international research efforts have really, I think, underpinned a lot of the important dialogue internationally on the role of lung cancer screening. And today he's going to be talking to us about his work on screening and effectiveness, and in particular results from his large-scale Nelson trial. Thanks, Harry, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Karen. And thank you, audience, for being there. May I go one slide back on the title page? It's apparently this one way back. And one more. Yeah, thanks. Just to, apparently there's something in the slideshow, unfortunately. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here at this nice webinar from the Daffodil Center. I'm being asked to give a lecture, especially on the efficacy, the effectiveness, what are the results so far from trials and so on. So I'm happy to do that. May I have the next slide? And of course, you may have of course may have seen the publication in the New England Journal from our Nelson trial. I'll go through the Nelson trial and the comparison with the NLST, and give a bit of information on the present trial we are actually running at the moment. Next slide. I hope you can hear me good enough. Otherwise, please let me know in the chat. So the Nelson trial roughly was about 16,000 people, 15,792 who voluntarily participated, of course, and about 85% of these were males. Now, of course, nowadays, we would never do that again anymore, I guess, this gender difference. But at that point in time, the prevalence of smoking in females was still much lower in those cohorts that we were going to approach, that we basically didn't have the money to again send out invitations about 3 times more to the females in order to get women in. And at that point in time, we actually said, well, we think if it works for males, why not for females? I know we shouldn't say that anymore nowadays, but at that point in time, we thought we were fine with that. Fortunately, we did have a group of women for which we actually have a statistically significant result. Roughly, they were randomized in 2 arms. Sorry, apparently I did something wrong with the slideshow. Apology, I will speak a bit faster. But anyhow, so it randomized them in 2, and basically they got a baseline scan, a scan after 1 year, a scan after 2 years, and another 4th one after 2.5 years. So we are the only trial that really had different intervals on purpose. You know, if you have different intervals, you basically get more information. It's a challenge, of course, if your interval is too long, you may jeopardize your trial, but of course not if your 3rd or 4th screening is at a longer interval. The 2.5 years is to some extent has been pragmatic. We had first money for 3 scans, and we got additional money for the 4th round. And at that point in time, we were roughly, the people were around 2.5 years already. So that's to some extent pragmatic, but it really learned that the 2.5 years actually is too long. Next slide. So we followed them up for 10 years. The big difference, of course, with the American trial is that we just referred 2.1% to a pulmonologist. So we had the scans, 2.1% was positive, and of those 2.1, and in those 2.1% positive, almost 50% of them really actually had lung cancer. So screening was detected roughly on all rounds combined in 0.9%. That's the major difference, of course, with the, this is fine. It was the major difference with the NLST. In the next slide, you see the data per round. around 1, 2, 3, 4, and the totals on the bottom. And roughly in all those rounds, about 90%, and depending on which group you look at, men eligible for screening or men undergoing the randomization, but let's say 85 to 90% of people participated roughly on average in all rounds. So of course, again, the point estimate you get is actually related to something like an 85 to 90% attendance rate in the trial. A bit on the right, you see the positive tests, 2.3, 1.6, 2.4, 2%, so on average 2.1%, and that detection that I already showed. Important to note, of course, we had an indeterminate test in for some people, and that was in, as you can see in the bottom, 9.2%. So in 9.2%, we basically, apologies for that, I didn't check that there was a slideshow going on in my slides. If you go back once, the 9.2% got an additional CT scan. For those, they really got the results. We have seen something on your CT scan. It's probably benign, or it's probably a scar, or it's probably a scar. It really said that. The only way to be sure, we repeat your scan in 3 months' time. So they were not suspicious for cancer. We did explicitly state that in the letter, and then we had them another CT scan in about 3 months or so. And then out of those 9.2%, 1%, so 1 point percent out of the 9.2%. Did get was referred for further investigation also. Next slide. So we see this major difference in the lung cancer incidence in the two groups. Here on the x-axis from 0 start of randomization till year 10, because that was of course the cutoff time that we thought we would have to look for mortality results. And you see this enormous peak in blue in the screening group, which you expect, more cases being detected earlier on by the CT scans. And of course, at some point it goes down again. The screens stop here roughly in year 5.5 or 6 or so. There was the last CT scan actually. This is fine, sorry. And the major stage shift. On the right-hand side, 46% was detected in stage 4 in the control arm. In the study arm, in the screening arm, the study arm, I should say, only 10% in stage 4 and 60% in stage 1. That's the difference you can make. And of course, we now look at all 10 years. If you look at the incidence stage distributions in all 10 years, of course, it gets diluted. But in the left-hand side, I specifically added the 203 cancers that were detected in the first 5.5 years by the CT scanning. So you have always to remember that when time goes by, the results, of course, are being diluted by the stop of the screen. Indeed, if we look at lung cancer mortality in the male participants, this is again the major result from year 0 to year 10. Control arm on the top in red, a 3.3 deaths per 1,000 person years in the control arm, and 2.5 deaths per 1,000 person years in the screening group, or I should maybe say the screening arm, the study arm. So the 0.76, 0.76, 0.76, actually in year 10, we look back, of course, we didn't look in between, of course, for good reasons. But yeah, then it may happen that you look back and see that actually year 8 and 9, that in year 8 and 9, there was already a 0.76, 0.76, so the same point estimate, but already statistically significant. So a 24% statistically significant reduction in lung cancer mortality between the two arms in males. Next slide. Sure, the all-cause mortality, always everyone is interested in that, although you of course, you start your trial to show a lung cancer mortality reduction. But here you see the all-cause mortality by time. Of course, they are completely overlapping. If you want to look, maybe the control arm is always a bit on top, but surely you cannot make much of that. Next slide. The essence, of course, is we don't have the power to look at all-cause mortality. My senior research fellow, Eveline Heinsdijk, looked at that, published in Cancer Medicine 2019. If you haven't read the paper, please do so, because there we try to look at how big these trials should be in order to get a statistically significant result on all-cause mortality. And what you here see, this is specifically for the lung. And this is actually, if you look at the black bars, it actually says that the first time that the bar is black, it says 40,000. It means you could get a statistically significant result on all-cause mortality if you have 40,000 people per arm. So an 80,000 arm trial, an 80,000 large size trial, but then you should wait for, as it shows here, roughly about year 12 or so to be able to show that. And if you look at year 10, actually you see you need something like 50,000 per arm. So we simply don't have the power for that. And I always say to some extent that the NLST has been a bit lucky with their size to show a statistical significant effect on all-cause mortality. Next slide. Of course, what is important to look at lung cancer mortality reduction, and apart from that, to see that the other causes of that in the male participants are just fine, in the sense they do not differ per arm. And we have published that, of course, in the New England, and later on I'll go to the letter later on. And actually we see in all major cause of that categories, there is no difference between the two arms. So there's a major effect on lung cancer mortality, and on the other hand, there's no detrimental effect in other causes of that. Next slide. It's true, there are two very small subgroups where there are statistical differences, and those are called symptoms, signs, and abnormal clinical findings, otherwise not specified, and endocrine, nutritional, and metabolic diseases. They are only groups of 57 cases in total, or 30 cases in total. So those are 87 cases out of the 1,800 deaths or so. And of course, we looked at those cases, and actually there was only one lung cancer confirmed in these 87. That one was already reviewed by the expert committee from the trial. That was not lung cancer. And then we have simply 3 other ones with a CT scan result, false positive in this case, because there was no lung cancer. And they died at least 16 months later than the CT scan. So again, this we published in the letter later on, but you may not have seen it maybe. So again, there's no detrimental effect on something else. Very interesting, of course. The NLST didn't focus so much on that. I'm still not entirely sure why not. But actually, we found also an effect. They also found an effect in the females. Well, we found an effect in the females, a smaller group, but still statistically significant. Sorry. And here you see in year 10.67, not statistically significant anymore. As I said, there is a dilution effect. You have to bear that in mind. But in the 3 years before, 0.46, 0.41, 0.52. 3 years in a row, statistically significant results, and huge effects, of course, more larger than in the males. We have published in an appendix that we think actually that the dilution effect in the females does mean that probably year 10 is logic, that it becomes lower and even therefore not statistically significant, but in the years before it is. Did we expect that, the difference between males and females? No, you could say no, because we started with a male trial, let's say. Next slide. But now, of course, we know much better than that. This is our lung modeling that we did based on the NLST trial. This is a publication by Kevin ten Haaf. And what we see here, the mean preclinical surgeon times, difficult words, but it means what is the time that the tumor is in in a time period that it is already detectable by the CT scanning in this case. And here you see on the top the men and in the bottom the women. And if you look at the total mean preclinical duration line, you see actually for adenocarcinoma, that's the first column, you see 4.48. And for instance, in women, you see 6.01, if you see that on the slide. And it basically means the time period that lung cancer is detectable in women is, we think, longer with the CT scanning than for males. And that may at least partially explain the results, even more efficacy, even more results, higher mortality reduction in women. That may be due to basically their smoking history. We find also more adenocarcinomas in women. And if we then even find them a bit earlier than in males, that may make a difference, of course. Again, you see in the small cell, nothing different. And of course, a smaller time period, something like 3 years or so, 5 years in squamous, and in the other category, something like between 5 and 6 years. So good to realize that's the difference we make with CT scanning. We are now talking about 3-4 years earlier detection at least. And of course, we knew with the X-rays, with the chest X-rays, that was something of a couple of months or so. Next slide. So then the comparison with the NLST, I took year 8 to be able to make a reasonable appropriate comparison. On the left-hand side, you see Nelson, 0.76, 0.41. The NLST reported 0.92 for the men, 0.73 for the females. So we have a larger effect in the Nelson trial than in the NLST. Even if we look at the NLST eligibles in Nelson, that's roughly the same point estimate as for the average Nelson participant, but nevertheless, again, we did that, of course, and again, quite a major difference with the NLST. Next slide. So a huge effect, 2 major trials, 2 power trials should show that lung cancer screening works. What is next? I'll go to a little bit about what is next. The major thing now is, well, if you look at the modeling, so far we often thought that given the growth rate of lung cancer, you should probably go for an annual screening interval. We showed, of course, that the 2.5 years is too long. The 2 years is maybe, according to stage and stage shifts, appropriate. But we see that if your baseline scan is negative, the chances for having lung cancer in the next couple of years is really, really low. It is possible maybe that if you have a baseline scan negative, you go for a different interval, but no one knows and no one has yet proven it is safe enough. Next slide. So we are happy to get European funded money, competitive money, but from the EU, from the Horizon 2020 program, and in 5 European countries, we will start this multi-centered implementation trial. So we are going really to implement, but really to see whether this screening interval can be changed based on baseline CT scan being negative. That's the only special trial element in the implementation. Next slide. So what we're going to do, a lot of text, but basically we're going to ask people between 60 and 79 years of age with a risk based on our PLCOM risk calculator, or to have a risk in the next 6 years of 2.6% or more, or a smoking history of 35 PEC years and of more, being a current smoker or former smoker who quit smoking in the last 10 years. And we asked them to be randomized between an annual screening or a biannual screening. And that means about 24,000 people. We hope, of course, in the future that maybe we get more information, biomarkers, to be able to maybe change this interval even to longer or not. We don't know yet. But anyhow, this would mean, is it safe enough if your baseline scan is negative to get a longer interval? Next slide. And this is basically on the right-hand side, the PLCO risk calculator, and it's, yeah, to some extent rather easy, about 10 questions that anyone can fill in. Basically, what we are preventing is screening in the too low risk population. Again, if your baseline scan is negative, you are really at a lower risk. Now already it has been found that if your risk is 1.83, you basically, it's even, you can do it with less CT scans and then get the same number of life years gained as the 1.5 that, for instance, was shown by the LST in the US Preventive Services Task Force. Next slide. I think I should look at the time, I guess. So let's say the other important thing apart from lung cancer is the calcium scoring. I open a new area, of course, but it's clear cut. Next slide. That the smoking, the ex-smoking, leads to, of course, cardiovascular disease. This is a paper from our other trial in which basically we show that family history, body mass index, but especially smoking, of course, has an odds ratio of 1.52 for a calcium risk of 400 and more or so. So of all these risk factors, it is, of course, smoking and ex-smoking, one of the major things to address. Next slide. So there is, we are also running a big cardiovascular disease trial called Rubinska, in which we are really comparing the calcium scoring, the classic cardiovascular disease scoring, and a control arm without intervention to see whether this CT scanning and calcium scoring is also effective in reducing cardiovascular disease. So the moment we have those results, and we're now in sort of year 7 or so, if we have these results, it is actually quite logic to probably combine this lung cancer screening with a calcium scoring in the same CT scan. Next slide. Next slide. Thanks. So the whole message is clear cut. Lung cancer, unfortunately, is the leading cause of cancer-related mortality. It's very nice that Karen showed these trend rates for Australia, and we've seen them all around the world, of course, that in the next 40 years or so, unfortunately, so many people still are at risk of dying from lung cancer, and we can do something about that because there are 2 major trials that show that lung cancer mortality can be reduced in high-risk populations. Here, I on the left-hand side, the NLST, on the right-hand side, the Nelson, roughly the same kind of curves, as you can see, diverging already in year 2 or so, 1.5 years 2, and it's 8 to 24% point estimate in the males and 26 to 61% in the females. Next slide. It's an honor that we are being mentioned now in the U.S. House resolution, although sometimes you can say anything about the U.S., of course. But anyhow, we are being mentioned by screening as demonstrated by another large randomized trial. They could have taken the name, but it doesn't matter. It's nice to see. Next slide. And so stepwise implementation is now. I made a calculation we made a rough estimate for Europe, and that means probably something in the order of at least 20,000 lung cancer deaths prevented each year. And that is actually the same for breast cancer screening. So if you're comparing stuff with each other, good to realize actually in absolute terms, we can do as good as a breast cancer screening program, depending on, of course, your eligibility criteria. And it's also one of the major first times that we go into risk stratification. And if we then can do even less screens, for instance, after a baseline scan, then we probably can come up with sustainable programs for in the future. My final slide, I think, is a disclaimer that it's true. We do not have much information on non-Caucasian populations and never smokers from all these trials. So that would certainly be something to address, is being addressed, fortunately, but it's very important to address. So thank you for the invitation, and I hope I've given you a bit the floor of what I think is information on efficacy. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Harry. That was an absolutely brilliant presentation. And I actually really loved your articulation of, you've obviously been working on Nelson for more than a decade, but it's not the end. And this is a process of continuous evidence building about how to improve screening even after it's established. So I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you in the panel session. And just a reminder to everybody to send through their questions on the Q&A chat function. Harry, thanks so much. So we'll now go to Associate Professor Vivian Milch for the next presentation. So I'm also delighted to welcome Vivian. She's the Medical Director at Cancer Australia, and in this role, she provides strategic clinical policy input to Cancer Australia's work to minimise the impact of cancer, address disparities and improve the health outcomes of people affected by cancer in Australia. She's also medical advisor to the Australian Commonwealth Department of Health on cancer screening policy across screening programs, and an adjunct clinical associate professor at School of Medicine, Sydney campus at the University of Notre Dame. So Vivian, we're really delighted to welcome you. You're going to present on lung screening in Australia, a policy perspective. Thank you, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Karen. I'm just going to start by sharing my screen. And okay, can you see that presentation there?
Yes, that's great.
Excellent. So look, thank you so much to the organisers for inviting me to speak today. It's an absolute pleasure to be speaking straight after Harry de Koning, who gave that great presentation. That's a perfect sort of segue for my talk. But before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the respective lands on which we're all joining today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging leaders. I'm also on the Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation, and I extend my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be joining us. So I'm Vivian Milch. I think I know many of you who are joining us, but it's great to see so many people joining this presentation today about lung cancer screening. So what I'm going to do today is just talk a bit about what Cancer Australia has been doing in the last, well, actually in the last 3 years, we've been doing this work. I'm going to talk about how we looked, first of all, at the existing cancer screening programs. We did a lung cancer screening inquiry, which I'll discuss. We looked at international and national research, and we've done quite a lot of work in the early scoping and feasibility assessment and stakeholder engagement around lung cancer screening. So as everybody knows, we have 3 national screening programs in Australia. We're very fortunate to have these screening programs and they run all in all very effectively. So we have a cervical cancer screening, bowel cancer screening and breast cancer screening programs. When we started thinking about what's next in cancer screening programs, there were a number of different options, but it is in lung cancer screening that there is the most evidence and the most pressing need, and it's a high priority for Australia. And I think that the data that Karen presented initially about the impact of lung cancer on Australians really goes to that. We know that in lung cancer survival overall is very much related to the stage at which it is diagnosed. So we know that if it's diagnosed at a later stage, so at stage 3, the survival rate's only 17%, and at stage 4, it's only 3%. But we also know that if it's diagnosed early, then lung cancer survival is really improved markedly. We also know that it disproportionately affects our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It disproportionately affects people in rural and remote areas of Australia and those of lower socioeconomic areas, and it's really, I guess, a priority of ours in terms of reducing disparity to think about how we can reduce the impact of lung cancer in Australia. So in 2019, we started an inquiry into the prospects, process and delivery of a potential national lung cancer screening program in Australia. And many of you have been involved in this work over this time. I must say that one of the things that happened in the first year of our inquiry is that Nelson trial by Harry Koenig's group was published. And I still remember that day. I think it might have been February 2020 when it was published, and we were really, really delighted to see that in print. But we had been watching over time the evidence for the mortality reduction due to lung cancer screening growing in international press, and we really it really added to the weight of what we needed to know. So we just started by doing an evidence review where we looked at the national and international literature. We worked with some of the members of this panel on looking at what risk factors there were for lung cancer and what the best eligibility would be for a lung cancer screening program. We had an extensive public consultation program. We consulted broadly, including with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community and health professionals who look after Indigenous people in Australia. We looked at the data around who is it in Australia who develops lung cancer, and we developed the design of a potential screening program and the mechanics of how it might be delivered, including working with economic modelers on economic evaluation. So in the end, the outcome of this was that it was estimated that really based on a lot of the work that Harry has just presented, that 70% of all screen detected lung cancers would be estimated to be diagnosed at an early stage, when they would be more able to be treated successfully, and the outcomes for people being diagnosed would be so much better. And the estimate would be that over the first 10 years of a program, over 12,000 deaths would be prevented in Australia. Far fewer, of course, than Harry just mentioned in Europe, but in relation to our population, such an impact, and up to 50,000 quality adjusted lives would be gained. As I said, we consulted broadly about the report that we developed. We went out to specifically targeting 150 stakeholders, and we received 45 written responses in relation from peak groups in relation to our report that was developed. And the majority of those stakeholders expressed strong support for the introduction of a lung cancer screening program. But they also raised a number of implementation considerations for a potential screening program. And so over this last 12 months, so from the beginning of the financial year 21-22, we've started a new body of work where we've been looking at all of those various implementation considerations. So we have been talking to our states and territories who would be involved in delivering any potential lung cancer screening program. We've really thought clearly about what are the workforce considerations, who would be the people who would be most impacted, and how and where are those people, and how would they be impacted, both as a direct relationship to the lung cancer screening program, but also in relation to managing and treating people diagnosed in a program. We looked at the screening infrastructure for low-dose CT scans. Where are those CT scans and scanners, and in what sectors are they? And we looked at what the requirements would be for the technological support for the program, including a register, and we've been working with the Commonwealth Department of Health on that piece of work. We've discussed what are the co-design elements that would need to be in place in order to make sure that this program, if it were to go ahead, would be developed with really key themes around co-design with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This is a really important aspect of any program, noting that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are disproportionately affected by lung cancer, and we really need to make sure that whatever happens, that a program such as this would reduce disparity, not make it worse. We've thought about program quality assurance and data governance issues, and we've scoped all the different program tools, guidance, information and communication that would be needed if a program were to be implemented. And we've undertaken a lot more targeted engagement and general engagement with key stakeholders. So this slide is about the guiding principles of a lung cancer screening program, and I know that many of you have seen this slide before in various presentations that we've delivered. I think the really important thing here, if you think about the principle at 11 o'clock there, which is agile, you know, one of the things that will happen to a program such as this is it would need to be agile. And one of those things, so for instance, the research that's taking place in relation to biomarkers, that might be there might be blood tests that could be added to the low dose CT scan in order to effectively triage who it is that would need to be followed up. And that's an example of where we might look at about making a program more effective as technology is advanced. But there's other principles which are very important. It needs to be a person-centered program, value-based, research and data-driven, and that's really interesting hearing about the European study, which will look at various intervals that lung cancer screening might take place, depending, and that research will be emerging over the next few years. It needs to be evidence-based, informed by best practice, and of course culturally safe and accessible. So we put together this screening and assessment pathway based on the evidence of the time, and of course the reason for having a screening and assessment pathway, which is actually central to all of our screening programs, is that you make sure that anybody participating in the program gets the same application of the evidence. So this is very much why a screening program is better and much more important than ad hoc screening. We need to be maximizing the benefits and minimizing the harm, and this is the way to do it. So we work out who are the people who will most benefit from the screening program, and in this situation we determined that would be people aged 55 to 74 and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people 5 years younger, just on the basis that lung cancer occurs in that population at younger age, and including current or former smokers. I won't go through this pathway, but it very much determines the way that a person would travel through the pathway. So looking at the policy components that fell out of all of that is that here we are, the population screening cohort that I've just described, who would enter the program in a number of different ways. Either by self-referral or facilitated through such a thing as, for instance, Quitline, or through an opportunistic way, such as if that person was seeing their GP at the time, or maybe a GP might go through all their records and call in all the appropriate people, and that would be organised. The application of this PLCOM 2012, which Professor Koenig just talked to, which is actually really trying to maximise the targeting risk stratification of the people involved in the program who would be eligible for the program, and therefore you would determine a population who had a PLCOM 2012 6-year risk score of more than 1.5%. Each of those people would have a low-dose CT scan, and if that low-dose CT scan was normal at baseline, then they would have a 2-yearly interval CT scan. We anticipate, or when we describe this program, we talked about the low-dose CT scan happening both in the public and the private sector, and also both at fixed and mobile CT scan units, that each CT scan would be reported with structured reporting, and the use of nodule management protocols to make sure that we weren't over-investigating every nodule that was found, but the nodules went through a systematic application so that there was evidence-based investigation and management of an abnormality that might be found on the CT scan. There would be an assessment, and results would be sent to a register, and that's very much a central piece of any organised screening program, and that register would then contact people to have their next scan, and that register would also collects and store data, and would be able to be shared and used for evaluation. There would be very much a program governance, and then there would be all the principles that I've just discussed. We've consulted with lots and lots of people over this last year, including health professionals who would be involved in delivering a program, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and consumers with lung cancer and consumers who'd be interested in a lung cancer screening program. And these are some common themes that have arisen out of our discussions. People have talked about importance of clarity in the patient pathway, the communication that we have both to GPs and to people in the community is extremely important, and that needs to be accessible and simple to read and simple to access. We need to make sure that we have informed consent and ethical considerations considered. We absolutely need to manage the stigma, fear and anxiety around lung cancer. It's interesting, one of the things that came out in a recent discussion actually is not referring to people as smokers or non-smokers, but people who smoked and people who used to smoke and people who don't smoke. You know, we've got to make sure that we don't label people for for a habit that they may have been that they may have done, which is of course the fault of the tobacco companies for a very addictive exposure. And then key considerations for population, priority populations, including people who are of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background, people who are culturally and linguistically diverse. We need to be building the workforce capacity and capability. Engaging with primary care is critical, and working with our multidisciplinary teams and specialists. Ensuring that we have robust data collection and reporting is critical, and developing a digitally enabled program. So where are we up to now? So you know that as Cancer Australia, we have a responsibility as the government's, as Australia's National Cancer Control Agency. We make recommendations to government about cancer policy and priorities. And we have been working together with the Commonwealth Department of Health on a number of issues in relation to policy around lung cancer screening. There clearly is strong evidence for low-dose CT scanning in mortality reduction from lung cancer, and we're just at the moment continuing early scoping and feasibility of a potential program, and there is a live application to the Medical Services Advisory Committee, to MSAC, seeking advice in relation to a proposed model for lung cancer screening in Australia. We have here a website, and there's a QR code if anybody would like to go to that, and that on that site we will have regular updates around lung cancer screening from Cancer Australia.
Thank you so much, Vivian, for taking us through those key policy elements for thinking about lung screening in Australia. And I really resonated with your call for really making sure that any screening that is done is, when we're thinking about population-based screening or even high-risk population screening, as in this case, that it's really in an organised screening framework. It's so important. And we know so much from the experience worldwide with other types of screening programs that it's really what underpins effectiveness of screening. Thank you. So keep those questions coming for Vivian, and we'll now move on to our next presenter, who is Associate Professor Mariana Weber. I'm really excited to introduce Mariana, who's an incredibly talented researcher I've been privileged to work with for many years. Mariana leads the Lung Cancer Evaluation and Policy stream at the Daffodil Centre, which combines expertise in modelling, biostatistics and epidemiology, and through these methods aims to optimise current and novel interventions for lung cancer prevention, early detection and treatment. She's a cancer epidemiologist and is also interested in modifiable risk factors for cancer more broadly. And her current work is very focused, and the work of the team, as you'll hear, is very focused on supporting the building of the evidence towards lung cancer screening. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Mariana, who'll talk about the work of the team. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. Let me just set up. The worst part of these webinars is getting the tech working. And now I've lost my notes screen. Where is it? Here it is. Okay, thanks for the introduction. I'm here to give you a whistle-stop tour of our lung cancer program in the Daffodil Centre. And as you've heard now from Vivian, Karen and Harry's excellent presentations, that lung cancer is still a major issue in the Australian population, still Australia's biggest cancer killer. It accounts for almost 20% of the total cancer burden. Survival from lung cancer is poor, with most patients diagnosed with late-stage disease, and a large proportion of people with lung cancer report poor quality of life and high levels of psychological distress. So there is a real sense of urgency that we get better outcomes for people who are at risk of and people who are living with lung cancer. So it's in this context that the Lung Cancer Evaluation and Policy Program was initiated. The program integrates multidisciplinary methods and expertise, including large-scale epidemiology, evidence review, mathematical modelling and public health research to determine how we can maximise the effectiveness of lung cancer control interventions and provide evidence to support public health gains. So a large component of this work over the past 7 years has been building a lung cancer simulation model designed to fill evidence gaps in lung cancer screening. The data input components required to model lung cancer screening range from Australian trends in both smoking and in lung cancer incidence, mortality and survival, results from large lung cancer screening trials and data on risk prediction tools, and lung cancer costs, patterns of care and quality of life. So a major project for us has been the construction of a predictive model of smoking behaviour for the Australian population. This required gathering and harmonising 26 representative health surveys covering people born over the last 100 years. These data were then used to build an Australian smoking history simulator. The model used a Bayesian calibration framework to estimate rates of smoking initiation and cessation, and using these rates like levers, we can predict what will happen to smoking prevalence over the next 50 years and in turn, estimate the resulting impact on lung cancer outcomes. But because smoking is not systematically captured in any population-wide health database, we can only estimate how many lung cancers are caused by smoking in Australia, and likewise we can only estimate how many Australians may be eligible for screening. To get these estimates, we rely on data from large observational studies such as the 45 and up study in New South Wales. This study tracked the health of 250,000 people over time and was used to measure the impact of smoking behaviour on cancer incidence and death. Some of the key findings from that work were that 2 out of 3 deaths among people who smoke are caused by smoking, that Australians aged 45 to 75 who continue to smoke die 10 years earlier than those who do not smoke, and that smoking as few as 5 cigarettes per day increases the risk of lung cancer 9-fold. The 45 and up study has also been useful for exploring lung cancer risk prediction tools such as the PLCO M2012. We used the cohort to validate the PLCO tool in Australia and found that it predicted 70% of the lung cancers that occurred within 6 years of baseline. And we also measured health utility values for participants who met the eligibility criteria for screening, which will be important for estimating the quality part of the quality adjusted life years calculated in cost effectiveness analyses. We are also involved in the International Lung Screening Trial, which is being led by a wonderful team of respiratory physicians from all around Australia in collaboration with other parts of the world, including Canada. Results from the trial will be used to inform Australian-specific screening parameters in our model. Other important components of our model include information on Australian patterns of lung cancer diagnosis and treatment and Australian healthcare costs. Our analysis of lung cancer costs using the 45 and up study have already been used to support Cancer Australia's health economic evaluation of screening, and as you'll hear in Preston's talk, form the basis of his model of systemic therapy costs. Overall, the broader objective of the program is to balance and prioritise investment in all aspects of lung cancer, from primary prevention through to treatment, and ultimately identify best buys in lung cancer control. As the component parts of our modelling toolkit come together, each component contributes independently to the global evidence base on lung cancer epidemiology. At this stage, Policy One Lung, our microsimulation model, is still in development. But next you'll hear from Sylvia and how she brought together these modelling input components to conduct a trial-based cost-effectiveness evaluation of lung cancer screening in Australia. So now I will stop sharing and introduce Sylvia. So Dr. Sylvia Bahar-Harpez was previously a lecturer in physics and mathematics at the Technion Israel Institute of Technology. The main research field of her PhD was high energy physics, and she was a member of the ATLAS collaboration at CERN Geneva and contributed to the search of the Higgs boson. Sylvia's current research focuses on implementing mathematical models to evaluate lung cancer screening in Australia and to provide cost-effectiveness results for policy decision-making. So today, Sylvia will talk to us about a trial-based cost-effectiveness analysis of lung cancer screening for Australia.
Okay, thank you, Marianne, for that. And hello, everybody. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, it's
Okay.
good, Sylvia.
Okay, great. Okay, so hello, everybody. I'm going to present our updated cost-effectiveness analysis of lung cancer screening for Australia. Okay, so to give some background, two major screening trials, the NLST more than 10 years ago, and more recently, the Nelson trial, have shown that screening with LDCT reduces lung cancer mortality by about 20% and 24% respectively. Yet few countries have implemented screening programs. In Australia, an inquiry led to the recommendation of a national lung cancer screening program. And still, during the past years, there has been a long-term need to build evidence regarding the drivers of cost effectiveness. Okay, so to estimate the cost effectiveness, we built a simplified cumulative risk model. The question that we ask is, if we run the NLST and Nelson trials in Australia, would they be cost effective? So we assume a screening trial setting. And the main idea is that we took the mortality benefit from the trials, that is the 20% or 24% reduction in mortality, and use it as a direct input in our model to estimate the life year gains. So very briefly, the steps of our model are, so first, we identify the eligible population in Australia and apply the lung cancer and other cause mortality, where all the data for this step is taken from Australian sources. Second, we apply the mortality benefit of serving the trials, and we use the modified lung cancer mortality to estimate the life year gained. The steps that come next are meant to estimate the costs and these utilities. So third, we apply the Australian stage distribution diagnosis and the stage shift observed in the trials to estimate the lung cancer cases by stage with and without screening. And we also account for overdiagnosis in this step. Next, we apply costs and these utilities related to screening, false positives, and treatment, where the costs are Australian costs. And finally, we calculate the incremental costs per quality. Okay, so for the results presented here are not for dissemination. This work is currently under review. The results that I'm presenting here are the cost effectiveness ratios obtained by running the simulation 10,000 times with 10,000 random combinations of the input parameters. In the base case, the CR for the Nelson case is about 39,000 Australian dollars per quality, with a wide range that goes from about 18,000 to 108,000 dollars per quality in the 95% confidence interval. In about 60% of the cases, the CR was under $50,000 per quality, and in 15% it was under 30. For the NLST case, the results were worse. In the base case, the CR was about $76,000 per quality, and the uncertainty in both cases is very large. Okay, the plot in this slide shows the one-way sensitivity analysis, looking at the impact of each input parameter on the cost-effectiveness ratio. Each row on the plot corresponds to one of the parameters. Green means lower CR, this more cost-effective, and red means higher CR, less cost-effective. We found that the cost-effectiveness ratio is highly sensitive to, first, the lung cancer mortality benefit from screening. And this is related to how many deaths are actually prevented by screening. The main reason why the Nelson results are better than the NLST is that in the Nelson base case, we have about 24% mortality benefit against 20% in the NLST base case. So that is the main driver of cost effectiveness. Second, the lung cancer hazard ratio of eligible participants. That means that in order okay, the second is the hazard ratio of eligible participants. That means that in order for lung cancer screening to be cost effective, it is important to select high risk participants. Third, the cost of the LDCT scan. Okay, the incremental cost is highly dominated by the cost of the LDCT scan. And that's why the influence of other costs is not so big. For example, we check the impact of multiplying the average cost of stage 4 by 2 or even by 4, and the CR didn't change by much. So the effect of reducing or increasing the cost of the LDCT from $300 in the base case to $200 or $400 is more significant than multiplying the cost of stage 4 by 4. In our base case, the average cost of stage 4 was about $56,000. Multiplying it by 4 gives $224,000. Now, we know that the cost of treatment for advanced lung cancer has increased significantly during the last years due to new therapies. You will hear more about this today in Preston's presentation. However, this is not a huge driver of cost effectiveness. A large number of LDCT screens is needed to avoid one stage 4 cancer case. And that's why the cost of an LDCT screen is more significant than the cost of the treatment. Also, we checked what should be the cost of an LDCT scan for lung cancer screening to be cost effective under a willingness to pay of $30,000 per quali, assuming the base case for all the other input parameters. And we obtained that an LDCT should cost $196 in the Nelson scenario and $7 in the NLST. Okay. We also explore hypothetical increases in smoking cessation rates in the screening scenario. Based on a systematic review, overall enrollment in a lung screening program seems to contribute to motivating high-risk individuals to quit smoking. So we hypothetically assume increased cessation rates by a factor that range from 1.2 to 2, assuming an additional lung cancer mortality benefit for each year since quitting, and obtain CR lower by 5 to 25%. We also compare the results from 2 alternate selection criteria, the PLCO risk calculator and the USPSTF 2021 guidelines. And we estimated that the selection of participants using the PLCO tool was more cost effective than any other selection criteria in both trial settings. To conclude, lung cancer screening with LDCT may be cost effective in Australia. Cost effectiveness depends on first reproducing the mortality benefit observed in the trials, and in particular the Nelson trial. And that requires fidelity in nodal management and uptake of treatment. Second, restricting eligibility to high-risk groups. And third, minimizing the cost of LDCT scans. Finally, our model is limited to the trial setting. The screening input parameters of our model were closely related to the trial setting, and so we did not have the flexibility to explore beyond these parameters. The next step is to build a microsimulation of the lung cancer natural history. This work is currently ongoing, and this tool will be much more flexible and will be able to model beyond the direct evidence. It will be able to study different possible interventions, evaluate different risk tools, and much more. And that's it. Thank you for listening. I'm going to end my presentation
Thank
now.
you very much, Sylvia. Well, our final presentation today is from Dr. Preston Nyo. Preston is a postdoctoral research fellow with experience in applying and developing health economic research methods. His PhD focused on the epidemiology, costs and treatment of lung cancer in Australia. And to date, his research has included characterising patterns of care for lung cancer patients, determining the clinical and economic impacts of novel systemic therapies, and estimating health utility values and quality adjusted life years. So Preston will talk to us about his latest research on the updated costs and survival expectations for individuals with stage 4 lung cancer. Thanks, Preston.
Thank you for the introduction. So I'm just going to jump right in. So as many of you may know, the treatment landscape for lung cancer has been completely transformed with the arrival of novel targeted therapies and immunotherapies. And these bring with them, in some cases, substantial clinical improvements, both in terms of quality of life and survival, as well as substantially higher costs from a health system perspective. And because these changes have been so rapid and recent, much of the data that we have about lung cancer costs and lung cancer survival outcomes are actually based on an old standard of care that aren't so relevant nowadays. And this poses a problem for some of our modeling for upstream interventions such as primary prevention and lung cancer screening. And so what we actually need then is a flexible way to evaluate lung cancer outcomes as innovations emerge so that we're not relying on out-of-date data. And it was for this reason that we developed this model called TXSIM. So TXSIM is a discrete event simulation that estimates stage 4 lung cancer costs and survival expectations, and it works in a relatively straightforward manner. What it does is it recreates the lung cancer population where each patient in the simulation has a histology and a biomarker status. And then it treats all of those patients according to an indication with treatment options that we specify. And the efficacy and the costs associated with that treatment and with the treatments that the patients receive are tallied over the course of each patient's treatment journey and then averaged over the population to give us our final outputs. So the model is quite simple in how it works, but it does require quite a few inputs, which I'll go through now. The first input relates to the actual composition of the lung cancer population, because lung cancer is quite a biologically diverse disease. In terms of, so regarding tumor histology, we use data from the 45 and up study. And for genetic alterations, which determine eligibility for targeted therapies, we use data from the CBio portal, which is an online repository for cancer genomics data. And we, for PD-L1 expression, we use the Global Express study. So PD-L1, as some of you may know, is important for determining and guiding treatment with immunotherapy. Another important input related to treatment rates, because not all patients actually receive treatment. And indeed, in the 45 and up study, we found that only 50% of non-small cell lung cancer patients receive systemic therapy, which has important implications for costs and survival. As for the treatment algorithm, that was obtained from a small sample of practicing medical oncologists here in Australia. What we did was we presented each clinician with a handful of indications that they might encounter in the clinic, and they had to list the treatment options specific to those indications, as well as the proportion of patients that might be receiving those treatments. As for the efficacy of those treatments, that was defined in terms of progression-free survival, and it was obtained from the relevant clinical trials. What we did was we took the progression-free survival curves published, extracted the data from them, and then fitted distributions to these data that the model could then draw numbers from within the simulation. And finally, we needed data relating to costs. So the cost of drugs were taken from the PBS, and the cost of companion diagnostics, which guide treatment decisions, were taken from the MBS. As for background costs, which I use to describe just the general cost of lung cancer care, not including systemic therapies, those were obtained from a prior analysis of the 45 and up study, with some minor modifications so as to account for, so as to avoid double counting chemotherapy. So with all the inputs in place, we could actually run the model and get some results, but first we needed to validate it. To do this, we went to the literature to find real-world studies that reported both treatment patterns and survival outcomes. And what we did was with TXM, we replicated those treatment patterns to see if we could get the same survival outcomes. We did this with 11 studies overall, and by and large, the model performed quite well, with maybe some interesting exceptions. So essentially, what we wanted here was for the red line to pass through the black dots, and that was what we found for the most part. And that gave us confidence that the model's results could be relied upon. As for what those results actually were, we found that 10 years after diagnosis, the life expectancy for a stage 4 lung cancer patient was 16.4 months, and the mean cost per patient would be $116,000, all, of course, depending on the actual treatment algorithm. So just for a bit of context, this $116,000 figure is about a twofold increase relative to a prior estimate that we derived from, again, the 45 and up study for a patient diagnosed 10 years ago. So there has been some substantial increases. Unfortunately, we still expect survival to be low for this patient population, though we do expect some modest increases. But unfortunately, survival outcomes will always be limited by treatment utilization because, of course, new therapies can only have an impact insofar as they're actually used. Among patients who actually do receive treatment, survival was substantially higher for patients who receive targeted therapy. So these are your EGFR patients with EGFR mutations, ALK fusions, and ROS1 fusions. And unfortunately, prognosis remained poor for small cell lung cancer patients, despite the fact that most of them would be receiving immunotherapies. So definitely a population with an unmet clinical need. And so in summary, TXM gives us early predictions for clinical and economic, for the clinical and economic impact of new drugs. With these new treatments, we do expect some modest improvements to survival, but accompanying that is a twofold increase in the healthcare costs per patient. And finally, these estimates can be used to inform evaluations of primary and secondary prevention, such as lung cancer screening, which is, of course, the topic of today's seminar. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Preston, and thank you also to Sylvia and Mariana for your presentations. And I think really together they give a sense of the program of work going on at the Daffodil Centre, which we know in response to, I think, Vivian's articulation that screening programs need to be agile, I think is really being set up to support the ongoing needs of any future lung screening program. So I'd like to welcome all of our panelists or speakers back as panelists, and we've actually had many questions coming through from the audience, so apologies in advance. I don't think we'll be able to get through all the questions, but we will ask our panelists to respond in writing subsequent to this. I'm going to kick off actually a question for Harry and then perhaps to get Vivian's perspective. We've got one question from Diane Brown that relates to the issue of never smokers. Do you think there are any future prospects for including never smokers in lung screening programs? And what would the evidence base need to be? And perhaps a related question from Kate Dunlop is perhaps any thoughts on the pathway that would be needed for never smokers and perhaps others at low or average risk if they were to be included in a lung screening program. So perhaps, Harry, first to you, then to Vivian. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, a very important challenge on the one hand. I think, and going to the pathway, I think it's clear cut that it is about harms and benefits. So to those individuals, we have to explain that for them, it's very likely that the harms are more than the benefits. There is radiation risk, there is false positives, and the chance of finding an early case cancer and having an improved benefit is really low. I think that's the way forward. And then surely there will be individuals saying, okay, I take my harm benefit ratio is different for myself than for the population, so I choose to either pay my CT scan myself or something like that. So we did analysis on how high should that risk be in never smokers. And our first estimates were it should be something like 20 times the risk of an average person or so to come up with the same cost effectiveness ratio as, for instance, shown in the trials. Now, of course, it really depends on where you put your cutoff. So maybe it's now 15 or 10, but even then, that's a huge number for never smokers. So I still hope, and I think that's the answer. That should be a reasonable answer to individuals. Of course, in other programs, you also make those arbitrary choices, I think.
Yes, and it comes back probably to communication around the benefits versus the harms to different groups, doesn't it? Vivian, your perspective?
Yeah, look, I guess I just second both your comments, Karen and Harry. You know, as a population screening program, I mentioned the importance of the population screening framework and ethical considerations. We always have to make sure that the benefits outweigh the harms. And for a population that is at high risk of lung cancer, so those people who have smoked or former smokers, particularly with other risk factors, and there are other aspects that go into the PLCOM 2012 in relation to the individual, and there is those series of questions which Harry mentioned on his slide. So for those people at high risk, the benefits outweigh the harms. For those people at low risk, it probably doesn't work the same way. It goes to the fact that lung cancer screening is just one aspect of lung cancer control. And I think it's a very, very important aspect of lung cancer control, but there are other aspects as well. So, smoking cessation is terribly important, that we actually integrate that with any lung cancer screening program, and that is a real focus, primary prevention, but also that we have a focus on early detection of people with symptoms. And it's a piece of work that Cancer Australia has been working on for a number of years, quite separate. This is obviously a lung cancer screening program is for people who do not have symptoms, asymptomatic people, but for people who have symptoms, we need more awareness of what those symptoms are, more awareness by GPs about the appropriate investigation, so that as soon as someone has symptoms, there's awareness in the community and of the health professionals who are looking after them to investigate them appropriately and refer them appropriately to a specialist linked with a multidisciplinary team to get the best treatment. And then, of course, the best support and we know we have an optimal care pathway for the best optimal care for people with lung cancer. So I guess it's sort of just part of the a whole toolbox that we have. But one of the things to say, and it might actually address another question in relation to other risk factors, is that one of the things we did as part of our lung cancer screening inquiry is that we worked with Mariana Webber and her team to look at what are the risk factors for lung cancer and what risk factors actually would make you at high enough risk to benefit from lung cancer screening.
Absolutely, very well summarised. Thank you very much, Vivian. I'm going to go to another question again, perhaps before we move on to the other panelists, probably I'd really like Harry and Vivian's perspective again, but Dorota Gertig, hi Dorota, has asked about the very high participation rates in the Nelson. Fantastic results in sustaining that high participation, Harry, through the different rounds of screening. I guess for you, Harry, how does that trial-based experience, do you think, or how will it translate into real-world screening programs? And/or is there more evidence to build in that regard? And perhaps, Vivian, then the Australian perspective on this, given that we know screening participation varies across programs from 55 to 60% in cervical and breast, and unfortunately only a bit over 40% in bowel, and what the expectations might be here in Australia. So again, first to Harry and then Vivian, thanks.
Yeah, another challenge indeed. But so of course, in the trial, of course, we first approach everyone by postage, and of course we did get some response, and that's of course more limited than the 90% that you see here. But we were able to see that the comparison with Statistics Netherlands, that the people who responded were really generalizable to the high-risk group. So it was a selection, but it was the correct selection, let's say. So apparently we found that already that to be possible. And now, of course, we're really going to implement. So we asked them for this trial element, but we're really going to, you all get the baseline scan. I think it's really good always to, so often people say, yeah, but then maybe, so again, in the UK pilots, the acceptance rates are in the order of 50%, 50, which is really, really good, I guess, because we have to compare that, of course, with the same acceptance rates in these low socioeconomic classes in the breast, cervical, or colorectal. And then actually also in the breast cancer, we see lower rates of maybe between 50 and 60% in the lower socioeconomic class. So then if we would reach 50% in lung cancer, that would actually be quite comparable or relatively okay, I guess. So the first results in many pilots, I think, and I think the UK is showing that best, I guess, is quite okay. And we will, of course, we will really do some different recruitment strategies to see what will work best in which socioeconomic class actually. So I am actually very positive about that.
Thanks, Harry. Vivian?
Yeah, look, participation is obviously something we're thinking about a lot in terms of the other screening programs. We have, suboptimal screening program participation. We know that it would make a difference to breast, cervical and bowel. I guess we've been very aware of that when we've been thinking about the scoping what are the tools and resources and communication strategies that we would need to bring the health professionals on board, bring the GPs on board, quitline counsellors and the community, obviously. So a lot of it is around communication about the benefits of lung cancer screening. One of the, I guess a key part is making sure that we work together with the populations who are most affected. So we've worked a lot on the co-design with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We know that in bowel cancer screening, it's been able to be demonstrated by Gail Garvey and her group in bowel cancer screening that if they work together with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population, they can really bring up the participation rates by communicating in a way that is meaningful from within the community, through song, through visual aids, through all sorts of different promotional materials. So we'll certainly be we'll be learning from the things that we know from the other screening programs. But good question, Dorota. It's participation's a challenge, and screening only works if you have it.
Absolutely. And if you follow up appropriately as well, of course.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks, Vivian. Well, I might move to Mariana. Mariana, we heard, especially I think in Harry's presentation, about some of the, the coming potential innovations in this area of lung screening, particularly, ideas like including, for example, coronary artery screening as a routine part of the assessment. You've presented on the body of work that the Daffodil Centre is engaged in, but what do you think are the big research questions in sort of the epi and population health side of this equation as a screening program might evolve, and what will be needed to stay agile?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing about lung cancer screening, is that it's relatively new in terms of the body of evidence, and there's just new results coming out all the time. And I think that's one of the fantastic things about having a microsimulation model of, lung cancer natural history, is that we can really, mobilize that model, relatively rapidly to look at some of these emerging elements. And I was really interested to hear about Harry's new trial, 4 in the Long Run, which is a fantastic name. I just love that. We can evaluate things like different screening intervals and personalized approaches to follow up CT scans, but in particular, we're really interested in looking at what happens when you embed smoking cessation as part of the screening pathway, and optimizing optimizing lung cancer screening in that regard, and also there's lots of great studies going on in across Australia, being led by Quan Fong and his team. He's got his mobile screening vans, so incorporating data on emerging results from his studies will be really interesting, and looking at the effects of recruiting particular subpopulations and looking at equity of screening and things like that. And then, yes, as you say, looking at how we manage these incidental findings that occur on CT scans, and looking at long-term benefits and downstream costs. And yeah, Policy One Lung is really going to be the perfect platform for looking at various endpoints over time and balancing the harms and benefits.
Indeed. Thanks so much, Mariana. Well, I'm incredibly sorry. It's obviously we've got many more questions, but I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to go back to Harry and give you the last word, Harry, to finish us. You know, you've you know, there are many questions here, I guess, about inclusions and inclusion criteria, I suppose, and we will try and respond to all of these questions, as I said, in writing. How do you, I mean, you work in a centre and you've been one of the pioneers of evidence building, primary evidence building and modelling working together. I mean, how do you see the tools in our armoury, given that we can't do trials of all the different possible inclusions, we can't do trials of all the possible risk-based management approaches in screening. So how do you see this evolving in the next few years? Do you think, how is the primary data gathering that you've described and the modelling actually going to fit together? And will that be able to take us forward in answering some of these crucial questions?
Yeah, the last question is, of course, a yes. So because actually every time we have presentations, we end with the sentence wrongly. It's not that the NST, the NST trial, of course, showed a 20% reduction, but it actually is the NLST with 3 screens with a 1-year interval, given this population, show that and that, and to go beyond that, we need modeling. And fortunately, I guess everyone sees that nowadays. I think, and so that's really good. You need the high quality data of those trials to build your model. Of course, we all know the stories and we all know the history of bad models saying something without the good quality data. But it's clear cut with this high quality data, you really can make these predictions. You get a good natural history model, and with that you can come up with different scenarios. So yes, unfortunately, without a trial, making something thinking about something completely different, again, like adding the calcium scoring to such an event. Indeed, I'm very positive about that if you see the major risk factor of calcium scoring, but still I think you need a trial to be definitely sure that it works. So this combination is the key for the future, I think.
Yeah. Absolutely, and we've been really inspired by you, of course, at the Daffodil Centre in terms of thinking about that combination of evidence building. So thank you. It's been wonderful to work with you and your team over the years, and also I want to particularly thank you, Harry, and our other speakers today. I know it's early in the morning in Rotterdam, so we really appreciate you getting up early for this webinar. So we are at time. I'd like to thank you all very much. Thank you to our audience. We will be making the recording of the session available to those on the mailing list, and we will be making a version of the slides available as well, although I do note that some pre-publication data was presented, so we may have to slightly edit that accordingly. And as I said, we will try to follow up with some verbal answers to questions. So it just remains with me to close the session, and we certainly look forward to the developments and the prospects for lung screening in Australia as we move forward. Thank you so much.